Joining us now from the Frankly Speaking podcast and the Daily Face-Off for the one and only Frank Seravalli. How are you, sir?
I'm pretty good. Not as good as Matt, getting a little Cabo Wabo right now, but I love that.
I don't know if I want pictures or I don't want pictures.
No, I was actually thinking about that. I was like, Matt shirtless on a beach. Ugh.
Shirtless everywhere. The man does not like shirts at the best of times. So
he seems like I don't even know if this is appropriate. He seems like a very hairy. Is he a hairy guy?
I mean, it's everything you'd expect. It's everything you'd expect. Yeah. It's
Happy New Year to all our viewers and listeners.
Exactly.
Take this conversation.
What a scene.
Thankfully, we don't know it. It's just left to our wild imaginations. Frank, talk to us about what you've seen from the Vancouver Canucks here in the calendar year of 2023. I mean, some of the point totals if we're actually talking the calendar year, Pettersson and JT Miller, both 100-point players over what effectively amounts to a full season's worth of hockey. And now, as we talk about this season as well, it's all tracking well. Words like contender are being tossed about. Do you believe it?
I'm not quite there yet on true Stanley Cup contender. Like I'm thinking like I usually have a group of 5 to 6 teams that are in that mix. And I think the Canucks are just outside that bubble. But here's the thing. I think they can get there. I think if they continue to make smart moves as they have, if they find a way to add to this team as we get closer to March 8th, now 65 days away, that I could see them breaking into that group because of how consistent they've been, because of how hard they work, and because of the, I think, game-changing talent, game-breaking talent at all 3 positions on the ice. Like, they've got the ability to really be difference makers, and they've really found some nice depth pieces.
There's a loss to the Philadelphia Flyers there in the holidays that brings up some issues, I think, for Canucks fans. And yet it's just one loss. How much do you read into the fact that a team like Philly has suppressed the scoring of the Canucks for so long this season with a 2-0 win earlier this year as well? I mean, everybody's extrapolating. Okay, there's a recipe there: the heavy play, the relentlessness of the Flyers. Is there a learning there? Or can you get lost in just a couple of games there?
I think you can get lost in a couple games. I don't think the Canucks are going to run into the Flyers in the playoffs, so I don't think that's going to be a worry. Although, could you imagine for a second the theater of John Tortorella against the Canucks in a final? I mean, you might have another riot. You might have another riot.
Yes.
But in all seriousness, I think people kind of get lost in the minutia of it. I mean, I God love their souls, but I was on with Harm and Quads a few weeks ago when there was kind of a dip in Pettersson's play, and they were like, "What's wrong with this guy?" And I'm like, "Guys, he has 5 points in 2 games. What are we talking about here?" And so it's always healthy for some perspective to take a step back, and maybe, for someone like me that isn't living, breathing, sleeping in the market on a daily basis, that for whatever reason, in Van, you guys seem to chew yourselves up on, oh, is there a recipe here with the Flyers, or is it just that the Canucks, there are certain nights in an 82-game season where you don't show up? And I do think that maybe if you take a step back towards that first trip to Philly back in October, and you remember the comments from Rick Tocchet after the game and how he kind of really laid into his team, maybe on the list of 3 or 5 turning points this year, that wake-up call might be on it. But this time around in January, with the sort of long track record that we've seen from the Canucks, or I should say much larger sample size, when you make enough deposits, every now and again, you get to make a withdrawal, and that happens.
Frank, with Jim Rutherford's history, and now we've seen that sort of approach has been passed along to Patrick Allvin in a time when trades have been hard to come by, and the Canucks have been active, and they've already made the Zadorov deal. But just looking at the way Jim Rutherford has operated, trying to get out in front of paying market prices, do you anticipate the Canucks getting a jump on the market again here if this management group truly believes in the group that they've put on the ice?
I do, and I think that they've been probably pretty active, one of the more active teams in making calls to try and, work through their list to see who's available and who isn't. That's going to crystallize and change a bit in the next 3 to 4 weeks. I know the connection has always been what about the Pittsburgh Penguins? What, is there a player from that team that, Patrick Allvin and Jim Rutherford would like to pluck? I think watching the Penguins, for instance, will be one of the more fascinating teams heading into the deadline. Kyle Dubas basically said a number of weeks ago that they have 6 weeks until early February to get their act together. They're meandering along through this season and not really breaking through, although their underlying metrics seem to be pretty good. Their goal differential, all those things that you would typically look for. And they've won a few games in a row. And then all of a sudden you look at the standings and they haven't really made up much ground and solidified a playoff spot. So I think to bring it back to Van, I don't really have any doubt in my mind that they're going to be active. My big question would be, there's a difference between being active and really being aggressive with the chips that you have to move. And that part, I don't really have clear line of sight yet on what exactly the MO of this Canucks front office team will be. Do they think that what they've accomplished to this point has been nice and we'll see how they, react when they're in the pressure cooker of the playoffs? Or is this front office going to, kind of throw caution to the wind and trade, those massive assets that you do have in your arsenal to try and really improve this team to go after it this year? I would say that, there's a lot of people in the league that would tend to believe you need to go through a process. You need to have some playoff entries and failures before you can really break through and win. But I mean, I think there's also a pretty long list of teams that didn't realize exactly what they had in front of them and the opportunity that they had that let that fall by the wayside.
So
also a lot of UFAs on this team, right, guys? I mean, like whether or not they can run it back for another year as this group, that's the other question. And whether or not, I think that affects, isn't it, Frank, whether or not they invest in their own team as a contender, because they got all these UFAs. The exact chemistry of this team is going to change for next season.
Well, and that's the other part of it to consider is if there is a 5 or 7 year plan, where are they in terms of what they've accomplished to this point? I'd say it's been a lot. I'd say the aggressive nature that they've shown to this point has been really impressive, but a lot of that was kind of maneuvering around the edges, fixing some of the salary cap issues that you've had with the contracts that you tried to unload or offload, then bringing in some quality depth pieces at prices that aren't going to break the bank. And I've said it before, stacking incremental, 5%, 3% wins on top of each other really adds up to something, but it's a far cry from being over the top aggressive, which I still think they have some other things to figure out first.
Just want to double back to the Penguins for a second here as it pertains to the Canucks, because Jake Guentzel seems to be at the top of a lot of fans' wish lists, and he's a pending unrestricted free agent, leading the Penguins in scoring. But how does it mesh with you go out and get Erik Karlsson last summer, you got Sid and you got Gino, and trying to squeeze whatever you can in the season that Sid's having as well? Like, is Jake Guentzel going to be on the trade market?
I mean, tell me in 3 weeks where the Penguins are in the standings. Have they broken through and become a playoff team? And if not, I think you absolutely have to begin plucking off pieces and moving someone like Jake Guentzel. He turns 30 next October. He's someone that has been in really close, a borderline elite player in this league for a long stretch of time. And if you're the Penguins and you've now had a second consecutive season where you missed the playoffs with the year that Crosby has had, with a healthy Crosby and Malkin and the addition of Erik Karlsson on the back end, and you still don't make it, you're going to sign Jake Guentzel for 6, 7, 8 years for what? To be the best player on the 30th place team in the league, as opposed to going out and trading him and beginning to recoup assets to turn this thing over. There aren't very many trade chips that this team has. He would be one of them, and you'd have to maximize value while you can, because I don't see any point in signing him to a long-term deal.
What are the Coyotes this year? I was looking at them in the standings. The Oilers win all these games, and only to be tied with the Coyotes, who are sniffing at a playoff spot. We're used to them being sellers around this time. Do they know what they are?
they've been saying for a while that they want to be a playoff team this year. They went out and made all the moves that they did because they wanted to take a step closer to being a playoff team this year. I think part of that is market pressure. They realize that they're trying to put down stakes finally in an arena, and they're not going to be able to do that if they have another season that's again meandering in the desert. So they're trying, they're pushing. I think that there's an opportunity that exists for Arizona to be a playoff team this year. They've got an arsenal of picks that they could move in order to bring in a couple decent depth pieces without taking away some of the runway from the young players that they've got in their lineup. But to me, it's really going to come down to Arizona, Edmonton, and Minnesota for those those two wild card spots. I see it as 3 for 2. Notice I didn't have the Blues in there. I didn't have the Kraken, who have been on a heater. I didn't have the Nashville Predators in there. I still, this mushy middle that exists in the West is really confounding, because when you look at St. Louis, who I think is ready to trade off pieces and has been engaged in some pretty significant dialogue, that St. Louis and Nashville have kind of admitted that they're not looking to compete this year. You should be trying to move as many pieces as you can to recoup value if you're not going for it. I understand the idea of not wanting to cut the legs off of your own team at the same time, but it should theoretically open up some holes for, Edmonton is right there already, and Arizona and Minnesota to get in that mix.
And in terms of the long-term longevity of that team there was some talk of a deadline coming up that they've got to hit in order to convince the NHL they're the ones to keep that team there.
The clock is ticking. There's no doubt. I believe it's January 31st that the goalposts have been moving. Some believed originally it was December 31st, but I think they've got a finite window of time to not just present a full plan, but like a concrete plan of, hey, steel is going in the ground, shovels are going in the ground on this date. And without that information, I don't know how the NHL could possibly keep this team playing in a 4,500 seat arena as a revenue suck for the rest of the league indefinitely.
Hockey is so much better when the superstars are going off. And Connor McDavid, 5 points last night in the Oilers win over the Flyers. Nathan MacKinnon gets the overtime winner in Colorado. Since the middle of November, Frank, those two guys have sort of separated themselves. I know Kucherov's right there and is probably going to be there the season that he's having. But how much do you think Connor McDavid finding his game, getting on a roll, fuels Nathan MacKinnon to stay in front of him in the battle for the Art Ross?
Probably a good bit. And by the way, I know he's not going to win the Art Ross, but don't sleep on Artemi Panarin in the Hart sweepstakes. I don't know that there's been a more impactful player in terms of his team success than Panarin has been for the Rangers this year, which look, anything can happen in the playoffs, but if I was sitting on a pile of money, I would be betting New York Rangers futures to be playing in the Stanley Cup final. I'd be betting specific matchups. It's also why I don't bet. So, but going back to that star battle between McDavid and McKinnon, I mean, how ridiculous McDavid last night. 5 primary points, crosses over 900 for his career. On paper, he's the 5th fastest in NHL history to 900, but it's actually way more impressive when you consider, putting everyone on a level playing field. Like, no disrespect to Peter Stastny or Mike Bossy, but they were piling up points at a time when there was 7 to 8 goals scored per game. I tweeted it today. You can find it on my feed, but Paul Paduti does an excellent job math-wise of putting everyone on a level ice surface. And if you actually go and look back historically and level everyone out based on scoring eras, McDavid is really kind of the 3rd fastest player in NHL history to 900 points. He's almost neck and neck with Mario Lemieux. And he's ahead of Sidney Crosby. It goes to show you how special he's been. And McKinnon, I mean, he has an NHL record now for longest point streak to open up a season at home. Like, he's been on fire all year, and I love his drive and determination. And it's going to be a battle, I think, until the very end.
You sat out this year's Winter Classic. I don't know how much of it you watched. If so, I'm curious your thoughts of hockey in a baseball stadium in the Pacific Northwest. But on top of that, and look, the Seattle Kraken, you mentioned it, they found their form again. Like, they were given up for dead 3 weeks ago, but they're packing on points now, and we'll see where it goes from there. I just wonder if anybody at the league, if you could sit them down, truth serum and everything else, like, would somebody at the league like Vegas to have put on a better show at the Winter Classic? You got your Stanley Cup champs. It's a game that is designed to attract, some new eyeballs to the sport. You get the champs in the game, and again, credit to Seattle. They did what they had to do. They win it in the shutout, and Joey Decord's a nice story there. But, as games go, that outdoor game I didn't think was necessarily a classic.
Well, maybe the game itself, but I thought everything else about it, and I did watch, the aesthetics were kind of unreal. Like, the attention to detail that the league puts into it. Seattle has clearly become a hockey market. I was just there a few weeks ago for the Board of Governors meeting. As you roll by some local watering holes, you see tons of Seattle Kraken neon signs, and it's become a thing there. And that, I think, is important to celebrate. But I mean, at least Vegas showed up with the Elvis walk-off stuff. I mean, that's really kind of the
That's
only
enough,
time they
Yeah.
showed up in the game. But, like, I mean, Mark Stone popping. I mean, here we go. Mark Stone popping some chest hair. I mean, what better than that? Like, that was awesome walking off the bus.
Now I've got visions of Sakaris in Elvis uniform for some reason. I don't know why.
He
From
would
the
make a
city.
good Elvis, I think.
He well, not voice wise, opposite octaves, but you're right, posture wise, yeah, not bad at all. We're getting
You
that much
said it,
closer.
not me.
Yeah. We're getting that much closer. You have to think somebody's going to break the dam here in the new year and make a significant player move, but maybe it comes right down to it. I mean, we've talked about the parity this year, Frank. It just might necessitate that determining, buyers and sellers is going to take a few more weeks, huh?
I really think that's what's holding it up. I think, even just feeling around a team like the Calgary Flames, like, they've been ready for a while now since the Zadorov trade to move other pieces, and no one's gotten serious yet. It's kind of like how I view the Pettersson and Nylander negotiations. Like,
Yeah.
those two teams are chomping at the bit to get these deals done. But when you're being slow played by the other party, there's really not much you can do. It's a two-party transaction. And same thing with trades. Like, it's great that Colorado can call the Flames and ask about Lindholm. And it's great that, the Leafs can call and ask about Tanev. But until someone's really presenting a serious and significant offer, you're kind of stuck.
Is there a point where either the Leafs with Nylander or the Canucks with Pettersson risk hurt feelings in all this, that they haven't backed up the Brinks truck, or does it not matter when the Brinks truck arrives as long as it arrives?
I don't even know that Brinks trucks haven't been ordered. Like, how, like, that's the thing, is, like, I'm not operating under any circumstance right now or knowledge that the Leafs and or Canucks have not acknowledged that they need to pay these players. I think it's been, in Pettersson's case, a grapple a bit over term. In Nylander's case, I think part of him wonders, like, is Toronto going to be the place? Should I go elsewhere? What does that look like? I don't have any sense that that's the case with Pettersson, but I also don't think either guy is really in a rush to do anything. And it's just kind of focusing on putting up a monster season that'll ultimately speak for itself.
To the players' credit, both of those guys, I mean, clearly this isn't, I mean, it may be, I'm sure it's in the back of their minds, but it's not affecting their play. And in fact, their play is just driving the meter that much further, isn't it?
And that's kind of what's the most impressive part about it. You can see so many guys crumble under the weight of this all important year, and those two guys have been lights out.
Frank, always a pleasure. Thanks for this. Happy New Year to you once again, and enjoy what's to come here over the next little bit. We'll talk to you next week.
Happy New Year, guys.
This great clip brought to you by, wait for it, Great Clips. It's going to be great.